Okay, we're going to start with chapter 1. And with chapter 1, we just start with just the basic introduction of what anatomy and physiology is. We will also talk about a few of the systems that we'll cover this semester, as well as A&P 2. And we will end with a few regional terms and some things that you'll see through the rest of this semester and when you take A&P 2. Okay, so whenever we think about where science started, this slide is just kind of introducing how we have grown over time. Initially, when they discovered things, things happened in the body, the explanation that they had was just superstition and magic. And then eventually, it kind of evolved into using observations and seeing when people died, this is what happened, or when we had some type of injury, this is how we heal. And so, just somewhat of an observation would be or was the way that they made sense of what was happening in science. And eventually, they started to experiment with that and make determinations based on hypotheses that they were making. And currently, we use cadavers and dissections to add to our body of knowledge for anatomy and physiology. So, when we say anatomy and physiology, those two terms are dependent on each other. And the term anatomy is in reference to the structure, the shape, the position of an organ or a structure within the body. For instance, when we go over or when you cover the digestive system, the anatomy of the digestive system includes the stomach, it includes the small intestines, the large intestines, the esophagus. It also is in reference to the position of those structures, meaning knowing that the esophagus comes first, it empties into the stomach, that then empties into the small intestines, and then the large intestines, and even the different parts of the intestines and the structure of the inside of the stomach as part of the anatomy. Physiology is more so the function of those body parts, meaning not only knowing the structure of the small intestines, but knowing that the small intestines is there to absorb nutrients. And knowing that the large intestines is there to absorb water, or that the bladder is there to store urine. So that is what physiology is. And those two things, anatomy and physiology, are very dependent upon each other. And the example on this picture is showing how our hand, the structure of our hand, makes it possible for us to, or it makes it possible for the hand to function as it's supposed to. Having our 5 fingers and the opposable thumb makes it easier to grasp an object. An opposable thumb makes it easy to pick up a coin off the floor. If you had a penny or a quarter that was on the floor, you could possibly pick it up without your thumb, but because we have it, it does make it a lot easier. So anatomy and physiology are dependent on each other. Now, levels of organization. Levels of organization is something that you probably have heard of before, and this is just how we go from those things that are the smallest, starting at subatomic particles, to those things that are the largest, which is the organism. And subatomic particles are those things like protons, neutrons, and electrons that help to make up the atom. And when we say atom, we're referring to like the smallest particle of an element that helps to make an element an element. For instance, an atom of hydrogen, an atom of oxygen, an atom of helium. And then we can put those things together to make molecules. For instance, a molecule of water consists of 2 atoms of hydrogen and an atom of oxygen. And then we could take those to make up macromolecules, which we'll talk about later. But a macromolecule example would be a carbohydrate like glucose, sucrose, lipids, triglycerides, which are lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, which is the example that's listed here, DNA. And those macromolecules help to make up organelles. And you may know several, like the mitochondria, the nucleus, the lysosome, the ER, all those are organelles, and they are found inside the cell. Now, the cell is where life begins, and we have various types of cells. We have muscle cells and nerve cells, and we have bone cells, and those cells help to make up specific types of tissue, like muscle tissue or connective tissue, which helps to make up things like bone and blood. And then those tissues, the specific type of like nerve tissue, may help to make up the organ, the brain, or skeletal muscle tissue can help to make up the deltoid, which is a muscle, which is an organ in the arm. And then those organs then go on to help make up organ systems, and those organ systems are the digestive system, the respiratory system, cardiovascular system, and so forth. And you put all those together, and then we make up the organism, which is the human body. And this picture just kind of shows exactly what we're going through, from the atom all the way through to the organism. Now, this slide is in reference to those things that we must exhibit to be considered alive. These are the characteristics of life. And several of these you may already know what they mean, but you do need to know them for the class. And movement, if something is considered alive, this just means that what was able to move at one point, not saying that they are able to move now or at all at their current state, but at some point in their life, they were able to move or have some type of movement. And responsiveness means that they can respond to or have some type of reaction to a stimulus that could be inside or outside the body. For instance, if you go into a dark room, your eyes will dilate. If you go outside where it's bright, your eyes will constrict, or your pupils will constrict. And so that's responsiveness. Also, growth, meaning that the body size will change, which is what we do from infancy through adulthood. Next is reproduction. Reproduction is being able to make more of the organism that we are, making babies. Respiration, meaning that we're able to take in oxygen, carry out metabolic processes, and produce ATP, and releasing carbon dioxide. Digestion is where we are breaking down those food molecules that we take in, absorbing the nutrients from them, and releasing the digestive waste. Absorption is where we are able to take materials that are in the body and absorb them into cells where they're needed. Circulation is moving those fluids or moving substances throughout the body. This is done, of course, by our circulatory system. This is the way that we get glucose to the body cells or get oxygen to the body cells. And then assimilation, those things that we absorb through digestion or absorption, we may not need that particular substance in the form that it is, but our body may need to assimilate or put some of those substances together into different chemical forms so that we can use them. And so being able to do that is part of being alive. Also, excretion. That last characteristic of life is basically being able to remove any waste that has been produced through all of these processes so that, again, that we can maintain life. And so that we can maintain life, we have 5 things that we absolutely need, and people can argue which one is most important or more important than the others, but I would say that all of these do play their role and they are all needed. The first, water. We absolutely need water. It makes up about 70% of the body, and it helps to carry out many of our metabolic processes. And it also helps to regulate the body temperature, which is highly important. The food that we take in gives us the glucose that is needed to go through respiration so that we can then produce our energy in the form of ATP. In addition to needing food and glucose, we also need oxygen so that we can go through our respiration or respiratory processes and make, again, the energy that's needed for our bodies. In addition to water helping with body temperature, we also have heat, of course, that helps to regulate body temperature. And it also helps to control metabolic processes because our body temperature needs to be at a certain point in order to carry out those things that are necessary to maintain life. And the last, pressure. We will talk about pressure in several systems in human A&P and how it helps to regulate, for instance, breathing. It helps to regulate filtration in the urinary system and a lot of different processes throughout the body. All right, so homeostasis is a term that you may have heard of a lot before, but homeostasis itself just means that it is the maintaining of a stable internal environment, keeping everything equal or level at the level that it needs to be, at a stable level that it needs to be. And in order to maintain homeostasis, we have homeostatic mechanisms that help to regulate the body in case those levels do become too high or too low. And so we have 3 parts of the homeostatic mechanism. The first is the receptor. Now, a receptor is something that's going to receive some type of stimulus, is going to detect whether or not there has been changes to the body. For instance, it will detect high glucose or high glucose levels in the body. Okay. Once the receptor has detected high glucose levels in the body, it will then send that information that from the stimulus it received, which is the high glucose levels in the body. That message is then sent to the control center. And the control center will then make a decision on whether or not or what needs to happen. It helps to maintain what we call a set point. And the set point is that stable internal environment. It is what is the level that we want to be. And so if our blood sugar is supposed to be between this certain range, the control center will realize that we're past our set point, so we need to do something. And so it then will cause some type of muscle or gland, which is what we call the effector, to respond. And that gland may release some type of hormone. In the case of the example that I've been using, if we have high glucose, then the control center will cause the pancreas, which is a gland, to release insulin so that our blood glucose level can go down. Another example would be If we have a receptor on our skin that may detect cold weather, if we're cold, the control center realizes that our body temperature has gone down, the set point is off, so we need to get back to our set point. In order to get back to our set point, it's going to send a signal to the effector. In this case, it could possibly be the muscles in our body to cause us to shiver. And so that's going to cause us to get back to homeostasis and our temperature to rise. And this is just a flow chart showing exactly what I was just talking about. Our stimulus that's going into a very cold room, or let's say another example, very hot room. Our skin will have a receptor that will detect that change. The control center will then determine that we have passed our set point. It will then send a signal to, if we're too hot, send a signal to glands, in this case, sweat glands, that will start to sweat. And once we cool, we will begin to cool off. Once that sweat starts to evaporate, we will start to cool. Okay, so that's homeostatic mechanisms, and you will see this a lot through the next few systems. In every system, there's an example of a homeostatic mechanism. I've mentioned the one about glucose. For instance, if it's too high, the control center causes the pancreas to release insulin. Once that happens, the blood glucose will go back down. Or in this case, if we're too cold, the control center will cause our blood vessels to constrict and also muscles to generate heat so that our body temperature can then go back up. So this is just another graphic to show homeostatic mechanism. So this and this is basically the same, but it just shows, it's just a different way to depict the same information. And this is specifically talking about the body temperature example, but you can use blood glucose levels, you could use calcium levels, any of that could go in this same exact chart. All right, so we have two different types of homeostatic mechanisms, and the very first one is called negative feedback. With negative feedback, is the one that you're going to see the most often within the human body. And the main thing for negative feedback is that it's going to cause the body to go to normal or back to normal. So wherever the set point is, if it's not where we should be, it's going to go back to the normal range. And one of the main reasons why it's called normal is because it is going to happen in the opposite direction of the set point. And these are the examples that I just gave you. For instance, again, I'm going to use the body temperature example. If we're too hot, it's going to cool us back off. Or if we're too cold, it's going to warm us back up. So it's going to be the opposite of where, or opposite of what the stimulus is. But then we have positive feedback. This is the one that you don't see most often in the body, but it is there and it does happen. And it's definitely still needed. So positive feedback, an example of positive feedback is where, so with negative feedback, we're doing the opposite. If we're too cold, it's going to warm us up. If we're too hot, it's going to cool us back off. But with positive feedback, it's going to intensify the change or intensify the stimulus instead of going in the opposite direction. And that's going to continue to happen until homeostasis is reached. The examples for blood clotting. Once we start to bleed out, we will start to then secrete clotting factors. We start to bleed, we start to secrete clotting factors. These clotting factors are then going to be continually released and continually released. That will continually increase until we've reached homeostasis, which means that we've stopped bleeding out. Or another great example, uterine contractions during childbirth. When childbirth happens, we start to secrete oxytocin, which causes uterine contractions. And then oxytocin continues to be secreted. We have more contractions, and they're intensified and intensified. More hormones are released, intensified. And when does it stop? When the baby comes out. And then that's when the feedback mechanism has then reached homeostasis. All right, so this section of this chapter is in reference to how we can organize the body, and you'll see these terms a lot in other systems. But the first two is the way that we just kind of divide the entire body into axial and appendicular portions, and you'll see these in the skeletal system and also in the muscular system. But axial is in reference to those things that are kind of toward the center part of the body, like the head, the trunk of the body, the neck. And then appendicular are the limbs and everything that connects the limbs to the trunk of the body. So that will also include the pelvic girdle, the clavicle, which is the collarbone, and the shoulder blade or the scapula. We also have different cavities within the body that contain different organs. The first is the cranial cavity. Cranial cavity is the head. This is going to be where we find the brain. And then we have our vertebral cavity that sounds like vertebrae. And so this is going to be where we have our spinal cord. Thoracic cavity is the chest area. And so this is going to be where we have our lungs. And it says thoracic viscera. Viscera is a new word. Viscera is in reference to organs. So in addition to the lungs, this is also where we find our heart. So viscera, anytime you see the word viscera, viscera is in reference to organs. So if you see that, this is organs. Okay? And then the abdominal pelvic cavity is in reference to all those organs that are found in the abdomen and in the pelvic cavity. And those, again, this is in reference to organ. So this is like the stomach, the intestines, the spleen, the gallbladder, the liver, and also the pelvic viscera, so that would be the reproductive organs and the bladder. These are just some other body cavities and things that help to separate those body cavities. So the diaphragm is the muscle that is used in the respiratory system to help with breathing, but it also helps to separate the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. But it is a muscle that you will see, or you can see, that clearly separates the abdominal pelvic cavity with the thoracic cavity, or from the thoracic cavity. And then the mediastinum. So we know that within the thoracic cavity, we have the heart, the lungs, the esophagus, trachea. And so the mediastinum is what kind of separates those organs from each other. So it's what kind of goes between the lungs so that it's definitely separated from the heart and the esophagus and the trachea and the other glands that are there. And I've already mentioned on the last slide about the abdominal pelvic cavity. Sometimes you may see the word abdominal pelvic. sometimes you may see abdominal and pelvic. If you see abdominal and pelvic, they're just specifically trying to separate the two. So the abdominal cavity consists of those organs listed here, but the pelvic cavity consists of like the bladder and the end part of the large intestines, reproductive organs. If you were to see abdominal pelvic cavity, that's just both of these together and all the organs that are found in both of them. And this diagram just kind of shows where those cavities are located. We have our cranial cavity here. This is where the brain is located. Vertebral cavity or canal, where the spinal cord is located. Thoracic, heart, lungs, esophagus. Abdominal pelvic, or the abdominal cavity, which is where we have our stomach, intestines, liver, gallbladder. And the pelvic cavity is where we have the reproductive organs, the bladder, the end of the large intestines. And this is just another view that shows the mediastinum, also shows the diaphragm. And we also have very, very small cavities within the face, the head region. We've talked about the cranial cavity already, but we also have our middle ear cavity, of course, next to the ear. Our orbital cavities around the eye. Orbital is a regional term for eye. Nasal cavity, which is what you may be already familiar with just from everyday language. And the oral cavities for the mouth. This is what connects to the mouth and connects back to the back of the throat. All right, so some other terminology that you will see throughout A&P 1 and 2. First off, we have what we call membranes. So we have all these cavities, and these cavities are lined by membranes. We call those serous membranes. They're double layered, and between the two layers, there's a bit of fluid. For instance, around the heart, there's a serous membrane that has fluid, pericardial fluid. Or we have around the lungs, there's a membrane, a double membrane, and between those membranes, there's fluid. When we have those two membranes, we have two layers. The first layer is called the visceral layer. Now, if y'all remember a few slides ago, I said that viscera means organ. And so this layer is the one that's closer to the organ. So if we have two layers, if we have the heart, the layer that is closer to the heart is going to be the visceral layer. So again, we have an organ like the heart. Of course, the heart does not really look like that, but if we have the heart, there are two layers that are around the heart. And between those two layers, there's a bit of fluid. The layer that is closer to the heart, this layer right here, this layer is called the visceral layer. And then we have the parietal layer. This is going to be that outer layer, which is going to be towards or closer to the cavity, and that's that layer. And for many of our organs, we have these layers that are around them. For instance, I was just mentioning the layers around the heart, and that is the visceral and parietal pericardium, or pleura is in reference to lungs. So we have visceral and parietal pleura, or peritoneum, that's around the abdominal pelvic organs. So anytime you see viscera, organ, parietal is the one that's on the outside. All right. And this is just showing a picture of what it really looks like on the inside. If you could take a look at this one, this is the abdominal cavity, and you can see the different layers around the different organs. But if you see here we have our heart. There are two layers that are going around the heart. And the inside is that cavity that has fluid on the inside. And here, the two layers that are going around the lungs. One that's closer to the lungs and one that's closer to the outside cavity. All right, so the next few slides we're going to just briefly go over the organ systems because, of course, we'll go over the organ systems in a lot more detail through A&P 1 and 2. But the integumentary system is where the first system that you usually cover, but it can be covered in any order. But the integumentary system is usually referenced as the skin. But the skin is the largest organ in the body, and it is the main organ, but it also includes all those accessory organs that are found, like the hair and the nails. It is there for temperature regulation, also the production of vitamin D. So when we go outside and get UV radiation, that helps to stimulate the production of vitamin D. Skeletal system, most of you already know that is there for protection, especially some of our major organs. One thing that you may not know is that it helps to produce blood cells. When we say blood cells, those are all blood cells, not just red blood cells. So red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, all of them. Muscular system is there to help us move, for movement, stabilization, body heat. We just talked about the homeostatic mechanism where if we're cold, then our skeletal muscles may start to contract so that we can generate body heat. So that is one of the functions for the muscular system, in addition to movement. Nervous and endocrine systems are there kind of tied in together, but it helps to function through nerve impulses or send nerve impulses to the rest of the body. It kind of helps to control the rest of the body, make decisions based on what needs to happen, keeps the homeostasis regulated because it is our control center. And then endocrine system is in reference to hormones. It helps to coordinate our organ function through our hormones. Cardiovascular system includes our circulation of gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide so that we can get oxygen to the rest of our body, and then to get rid of carbon dioxide. Also nutrients like glucose or any proteins or lipids, and get rid of any type of waste through our excretory system. And then our lymphatic system has a couple functions. Is to help regulate or keep our lipids levels regulated. Also, it's our kind of immune system. That's another word that you usually see for a lymphatic system. It's there to fight off any type of diseases or pathogens. Then our digestive system is there to get rid of any digestive waste, meaning food that we have taken in, broken down, and not absorbed will then be excreted through the digestive system. Respiratory system is there so that we can exchange gases, primarily our trachea and our lungs. There are a few other parts, but you'll get to that. And then during for our urinary system, it's also there to remove waste, but it also can help with, or it does help with, electrolyte balances and water balance. And you'll go into a lot more detail when you get into the urinary system as well. And then we have our reproductive system. Reproductive system is one that's going to be, of course, unique for male and female. But the primary goal for the reproductive system is to produce sex cells and to help with reproducing more babies. And our female is there to develop the baby and also childbirth. All right, so the last few slides are in reference to anatomical terminology, anatomical positions, and a lot of these terms you will see in previous, or in not previous chapters, in upcoming chapters, and systems. And so there may be a lot of terms that you are going to see now that you have no idea what they are at this point, but you will be using these over the course of A&P 1 and 2. Okay? So when we say anatomical position, usually on diagrams that you see in human A&P books or posters, you'll see a person or a diagram standing in the anatomical position. That just means that a person is standing upright, they're facing forward, their palms are facing forward, their hands and arms are hanging by their sides, their legs are straight, and their feet are parallel and they're forward as well. So this is what we consider to be the anatomical position. Some other terms as in relation to direction or position. The first is superior. Superior and inferior are opposites of each other, where superior is above and inferior is below. So an example would be that the cranial cavity is superior to the thoracic cavity, or the pelvic cavity is inferior to the abdominal cavity. Okay. Next, we have the anterior, which is also called ventral or can be used interchangeably, and posterior. And you could also use dorsal to describe it. So things that are on the anterior part of the body would be your mouth, your nose, your kneecap. Those are anterior parts of the body. Posterior would be the lower back, the buttocks, and we have regional terms for all of these things that we'll introduce in a few. Medial is always like middle or midline. We say the midline of the body, that's like from like the center of the body, like the center of the face, going down your nose all the way down through the center of your chest, through your breastbone. That will be considered the midline. And then lateral is away from the midline or to the side. So your ears are lateral to your nose. And in football, there's something called a lateral pass. And it is a pass that is to the side or away from the middle of the field. Bilateral, we just said that lateral is side, and so a bilateral structure is where we have two on both sides. For instance, our ears are bilateral, arms bilateral, legs bilateral, eyes bilateral. And then ipsilateral, we have two on the same side. Or contralateral on opposite sides. Okay. Proximal is close. So if someone is using proximity, a person would stand close to you. And distal is farther away. And this is all in reference to the midline or to the trunk. So the shoulder is proximal to the trunk, or the fingers are distal. And then we have superficial and deep. Superficial is surface. If you ever hear someone say that a person is superficial, a lot of people will say, well, that means they're fake. But no, what do they value? They value those things that are on the surface. They value looks. And so a person that's superficial is valuing the surface. And so a superficial cut, for instance, that's something that you'll talk about in the integumentary system, is one that's on the surface of the skin. Very easy to heal, no problems. But then you have a deep cut or a deep injury is where it goes more internal. And this diagram just kind of shows those that we just made reference to. And then we can also take the body and divide them into planes. And when we do our dissections, or when you do dissections, you will have to do different types of cuts, and they may be a sagittal or transverse or frontal section or cut. So sagittal is where we are separating the body into left and right. So if we were cutting the brain into left and right hemispheres, that will be a sagittal section or sagittal cut or sagittal plane. And I'm going to go back, or not go back, go forward to this picture so that you all can see what that is. But this will be the sagittal plane here, where it's going right down the middle of the body. And then you have the transverse or horizontal cut, where it's separating the body into superior, which is, remember, top or above, and inferior, which is below. And that would be this plane, the orange plane, separating into superior and inferior portions. And then we have our frontal section or coronal section. The way that I kind of remember frontal, it separates the front from the back, or the anterior from the posterior. So the anterior and the posterior one would be this kind of purple like plane here that separates the front of the body from the back of the body. Okay. And this is a great example that shows you these different cuts or sections. And usually if you get a chance to do, or when you do a brain dissection, one of the first cuts, if you have a whole brain, is to cut the brain in half using a sagittal cut. And then usually you may do a frontal cut so that you can see the gray and white matter of the brain. And then you have the transverse cut where you're separating the top and the bottom halves as well. We can also separate the body into quadrants as far as the abdominal regions or quadrants. And we'll talk more about this, or you'll talk more about this when you get into the body systems. But we have like the epigastric, gastric is stomach, but then epi means above. Umbilical region, which is over the navel. Pubic is in every area of the pelvis. Inguinal is going to be where we have the groin. Okay, so it just kind of separates the body into different quadrants. Just another way to separate. And then you have your right and left. And I do want to point out that if you notice, if you're looking at this, your left is over here and your right is over here. But that's not quite how the diagrams are labeled. In Human A&P, it's always in reference to the way that it's facing you. So if a person is facing you, if we're talking about this person's left and this person's right, then this, because they're facing you, this is their left and this is their right. And so that is why this is labeled as the upper right quadrant and lower right quadrant. And this is the left. And that's why these are considered left and these are the right. And this will definitely come into play in systems like the cardiovascular system when you're having to label the heart or identifying the left and right lungs. So definitely make sure that you remember that in Human A&P, when you're looking at a diagram or an image, it's in reference to the structure or the person or the images left and right, not your left and right. And the last one is body regions. With body regions, these are just terms that we use to describe different parts of the body without saying finger or ear or eye. And I'm not going to just read these to you. I would say that you need to spend some time studying these. Now, there is a Quizlet that's on Canvas, or there is a Quizlet that you can find and maybe post it in Canvas, and maybe you can just find one elsewhere. Or you can create your own Quizlet of these regional terms, because you will see these from this point forward. For instance, frontal is one that you will see a lot, because this is the frontal region of the head, but this is also the frontal bone, the frontalis muscle, and the frontal lobe of the brain. Another example, occipital, which is the back of the head. That's the occipital region. That's the occipital bone, the occipitalis muscle, and the occipital lobe of the brain. So many of these things, if you remember them or get them digested now, then you will do fine as you go through the other systems. But I definitely encourage you to spend some time, maybe make a Quizlet or flashcards or whatever you need to, whatever tool you can use, even if it's just maybe a PowerPoint where you have the regional term on one slide and then on the second slide have the match or the answer to it. But you do need to spend some time getting to know what these regional terms are and what they mean. Some others I want to point out to you. Some of these may be ones that you may already know. For instance, gluteal is buttocks, named for the gluteus maximus. Carpal, you may have heard of carpal tunnel syndrome. That's the wrist. Okay. Patellar is one that we'll see a lot. Patellar is named because that is the bone that's there, the patellar bone. If you remember that, then you know it when we get into the skeletal system. Or the femoral, that's the thigh. If you remember that, then you'll have the femur bone, rectus femoris muscle. We have the tarsals. Those are the ankles. So many of these, again, you will see in upcoming lessons, in upcoming units, and in A&P 1 and 2. So I encourage you to spend some time with these so that when you see it, you will know them. And you may not know them initially all in one night, or maybe even within a week, but you definitely need to spend some time in this, or trying to remember these body regions. All right, and so that is the end of this chapter. Let me know if you have any questions.